Hello everyone, Adam Jacobs here, Senior Solution Architect for the US Federal Team, and today I'm going to walk through how to work with color functions in Qlik. So these are the various color functions we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with the predefined colors that you can call out in Qlik, and then move into all of these different functions that you can use to generate colors for your charts, tables, graphs, etc. So without further ado, let's get started. So here you're going to find the predefined values in Qlik. So you can see we've got all these various functions, black, blue, brown, etc., and what their corresponding RGB value is. We'll touch on RGB in a second. But essentially you have these color functions. There is an option to put what's called an alpha number in between, which basically will give you the opacity of the color. So let's take a look at how this actually works. Okay, so here we have a bar chart that we are going to use, and we are going to be coloring this bar chart today. So first we're going to start with those predefined colors as we talked about. So I'm going to go into my properties panel here, open up colors and legend. I'm going to take off the auto, and I'm going to change this to color by expression. I want to make sure, by the way, that this checkbox, the expression is a color code, is checked. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to put an expression in, and we're going to start with, let's just say we want this to be blue. So all we have to do is just type in blue, open, close parentheses, zoom in here so you guys can see that. So that's all we're going to need. You hit apply, and now my chart is going to be that blue color. If I change this to black, now my chart's going to be black. We talked about that alpha color. So that alpha color, if I go in and I say I want this to be black 128, notice that now there is an opacity that exists within this black. So one of the nice things is that you can use not only different colors with an if function, for example, or a pick match, which we do have another video on the difference between if and pick match. We won't cover that today. But let's say I wanted to write this as if fiscal underscore year equals FY 2018, black 128, else just black with no opacity. What happens is that now I can see the difference between the bars, whereas most of them are solid colored, the other is opaque. So this is an example of utilizing predefined color functions inside of a chart. So let's talk about getting a little bit more specific with our colors. So we can use what's called RGB to define a very specific color in Qlik. So let's show what that would look like. So let's go into our expression. Going to zoom in here, and let's remove this. And so let's create a color, RGB, and RGB of course stands for red, green, blue, where there are 3 values in between the parentheses. And those values stand for the red, the green, and the blue values, and they're all between 0 and 255. So for example, if we wanted to show a color that was had 0 red in it, 101 green, and let's say 105, let's go up to 115 blue. Okay, so there's our expression, and if we apply this, this is now going to be the color that we're working with. Okay, of course, that gives it a single color across all of this. So let's actually show what happens if we try to use this to create what's called a gradient in our chart. And we can do that by applying a calculation inside of the RGB function. So this is the calculation we're going to use inside of Qlik in order to make sure we are calculating everything correctly to get this gradient. Let's talk about what exactly this is and why it works. Okay, so first of all, I think probably the first important thing to note is that column with a number in here, that can be as low as 1 up to as many numbers as you need, that actually grabs the measure that exists in your chart. If you have more than one measure, then you would say, and you wanted to use the second measure, you would say then column 2, for example. Or if you have 3 measures, say column 3, etc. This is useful because this just grabs whatever column or whatever measure you're working with and makes it available in this calculation. You can apply this calculation across all of your different charts, and even maybe put it inside a variable so that you don't even have to type this out every single time. You can just call the variable. Makes it very, very useful. All right, so what else is happening here? So first you'll notice it's wrapped inside a rank function. So a rank is going to say, I'm going to take all the values inside of this column and I'm going to rank them based on what value they are compared to the total. And it's important to put the total in here because the total is going to say, look across all of the rows in the straight table equivalent of this chart and tell me what is the total rank of this. What is this, the first highest ranked? Is it the lowest ranked? Is it somewhere in between? That total is important. So that gives it a value of a number between 1 and however many rows there are inside of this chart. You then want to divide that by the total number of rows inside the chart. So again, we're using number of rows, and then of course we're using this total function. So this number is always going to be constant, and it's going to say, look at what the total number of rows is. So now when we divide this numerator by this denominator, it's going to be a value between 0 and 1. And that becomes really important because it helps us be able to calculate values appropriately. Okay, so now let's make this work inside of our color expression. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open the expression editor. I'm going to zoom in here so that everyone can see what we are working with. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this first value. I'm going to change the red value. So I want this red to adjust based on the calculation that we just provided. So I'm going to change this to rank total column 1 divided by number of rows total. And then what I'm going to do is, because this is going to give me a value between 0 and 1, but the red value needs to be somewhere between 0 and 255, I'm just going to multiply it by 255. Okay, so this is now my new calculation here. So let's see how this works inside of our chart. We'll notice that now the closer that it gets to the high end, okay, or the lower, or I should say the lower the rank, or basically the higher the rank number, the more it gets towards red, whereas the lower the rank or the higher the value, the closer it is to this kind of teal color that we have going on here. So that's a great example of how to use a calculation inside of a color expression to get a gradient value going on. Okay, so that's RGB. There are a number of other color functions that we're going to touch on pretty quickly here. Let's start with HSL. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminosity. And just like RGB, it does take 3 arguments inside of it, but those values, instead of being between 0 and 255, they're between 0 and 1. And they don't just have to do with the color itself, but with just how bright and saturated those colors are. So if we come in here, okay, and we can adjust our calculation here. First, we're going to say this is HSL. Let's make this 0.5. We'll have the second argument be our calculation, which would be the saturation. Okay, and then we'll change the luminosity to also be 0.5. Now let's see what that does to our calculation here. So there we go. So now this is a different color. Of course, this is because we are just changing the saturation. We are looking at a single color with different saturations. If we adjusted this to be where the hue is changing and the saturation remains constant, so 0.5 here, now look, it goes across a color spectrum. Okay, so that we're looking at all sorts of different colors based on the calculation. So that right there is HSL, where it also still takes 3 separate arguments. So there's also a more simple color function that takes the values, just takes a value between 0 and 255 and applies a color to that. So if we come in here and we zoom in on our expression, change this to color, take out the commas because, again, it's a single number that it takes. And we're just going to multiply this by 255, okay, so that it resolves to something between 0 and 255. And we click apply. And now you can see that it is going to give us a range of colors based on the value that falls between 0 and 255. So next we have color map hue. So color map hue goes through red, passes through yellow, green, cyan, blue, and magenta, and then returns to red. And it will actually return what's called the ARGB value, which means that there is that alpha character that gets taken into account. Color map hue takes a single number between 0 and 1 in order to give the color here. So if we have our color map hue, and with our number here that is going to fall between 0 and 1, the application there looks something like this. Okay, so with this is going to start at red, pass through all these colors, and move all the way back to red at a certain point. We then have a very similar color map jet. The difference between color map hue and color map jet is that color map jet actually starts with blue instead of red, passes through cyan, yellow, and orange, and then goes to red. So if we look at that, color map jet, we'll just change hue to jet and click apply. Now you'll notice starting with blue as the highest value, moving all the way down through to red. We also have what's called ARGB. ARGB is similar to RGB, but it takes a fourth argument that is the alpha, or the opacity of the of that value, of that color. And so one thing we can do with that, if we go to our expression here and zoom in, let's change this to ARGB. Every single value in ARGB, all four are resolved between 0 and 255. So we are going to multiply the ARGB here by 255. We'll say this is a value with 0, 101, and 115. And so now if this is our argument, it will give an RGB color that is 0, 101, 115, and then this is going to change the opacity based on our calculation here. So we'll zoom back out, we will apply, and notice that what happens here is that now the higher the value, the more opaque. We can of course change this a little bit by just changing our calculation slightly. If we multiply column 1 by -1, essentially what that's going to do, that's going to reverse the rank. So if we do that and we hit apply, notice that now that reverses these colors, so that now the higher colors are more clear, the lower colors are more opaque. Okay, so finally we have our color mix colors. So color mix functions are, there's color mix 1, color mix 2. Color mix 1 takes a calculation, defines that falls between 0 and 1, defines a 0 color and a 1 color, and gives a gradient between those two colors based on where the calculation falls between 0 and 1. Color mix 2 works very similarly. The only difference is that this is now values between -1 and 1. You define a 0 color value, a 1 color value, and a -1 color value. So the difference between these two, color mix 1 is good for some of the things we've been doing right now already, where we're just taking a single value and seeing how the gradient works between those two. Color mix 2 is good for if you have two different calculations, two different measures, and you want to compare the two and seeing how that color is going to work between those two different comparisons. Okay, a quick warning between these, or for these though. Color mix 1 and color mix 2 do not perform in Qlik as well as the other color functions we've been working with so far. So just a warning on that, and even after showing the color mix 2, I'll actually show you how you can use color mix 2, an ARGB or an RGB color function to achieve the same effect as a color mix 2. Okay, we're going to show the color mix functions in a table. We still have the same dimension we were using before, which is the fiscal year quarter. In this case, column 1 is going to be our total spend. Column 2 is DoD spending, and column 3 is non-DoD spending. We're going to use these two to compare for the color mix 2 function, which is what that's very useful for. All right, so color mix 1, let's change the value for total spend here. We are going to change the background color expression. That's how you color tables. It's slightly different than most other charts. So for the background color expression, we're going to use color mix 1. We need to first define the value between 0 and 1 expression. So that is going to be rank total column 1 divided by number of rows total. Okay. And then we are going to define the 0 color expression. We'll say that is red. So the closer to 0, we want it to be red. Say the closer to 1, we want that to be green. So we'll define that, click apply, and now you can see that that gives a gradient for our background color expression. We could, of course, just like we did earlier, we can do this utilizing RGB. So the way to change this so that it utilizes RGB to go between red and green, all we have to do is we just change this to RGB. We have our first one, so the red value here, we'll delete this part. The red value is our first argument, so we'll multiply that by 255. Okay, then we are going to actually use pretty much the same function here, but instead we are going to reverse it. So they'll say that the further away, or the opposite, is going to be our green. So as it gets closer to the red, it gets further away from the green, and vice versa. And then we're not going to have any blue in this at all. So if we do that change, slightly different coloring here, but has the same effect. Okay, actually in this case it's reversed as well. So green is actually the higher in this instance, whereas red is lower. But that is actually going to function better than a color mix 1, but you can see how color mix 1 works versus utilizing an RGB. All right, let's talk about color mix 2. We'll do color mix 2 inside of DoD spending here. So for color mix 2, we need to somehow change this so that it falls between -1 and 1 as opposed to 0 and 1. So the way we're going to do that is we are going to take the rank of one column and subtract it from the rank of another column. Okay, and so that way the higher the difference, the further it is to the further it is on one end of the extreme or the other. Okay, so we'll do rank total column 2 in this case, because we're taking DoD spending divided by number of rows total. Okay, so that's 1. We're going to subtract that. I'm just going to copy this here. We're going to subtract that by the same calculation, but for column 3, which is our non-DoD spending. And then we're going to define, we have to define a color 1 and a color -1. So the first one is the -1, so we'll define that as red. We'll define the 1, we'll say that's blue. So we will do that blue. Now it's an option to define the 0. We don't have to define a 0. So let's see first what it looks like when we don't define a 0. Okay, so what it looks like is like that if we don't define a 0. If we define a 0, say the 0 is white, then that's what this looks like. Okay, but again, it doesn't function as well as utilizing something like RGB. So if we wanted to compare, the way we would do comparing these two utilizing an RGB function instead is we'll go into the non-DoD spending here to do this. We'll say that we want RGB, okay, and we want to actually, when we want to start with going between red and blue. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll actually say we want column 2 minus column 3. As our first part. Okay, that's going to be our red, so we'll multiply that by 255. The other one, which would be, well, we want to no green, and then the other one is going to be defining the blue. So in this case, again, I'm going to paste, but instead of column 2 minus column 3, we're going to do column 3 minus column 2, multiply by 255. So now we have our expression. A little bit longer of an expression, but I actually think that this actually works a bit better. It's as opposed to defining the ranks first and then subtracting those, it actually subtracts the values and then ranks that difference. So I think it's actually a bit more accurate and it's going to perform better. Again, slightly different colors that you're looking at here because we're defining things a little bit differently, but you can always play around with that to make sure that the colors are going to work a bit better. In this case, of course, again, we kind of reversed course here a bit, but it's going to be slightly different than our color mix 2 values. There are ways to work around this, but at the end of the day, this is how color functions work. I always suggest that if you can, avoid color mix functions and do the other ones, but color mix certainly does have its usefulness where appropriate. So thank you very much for watching. Hope this has been useful for you and hope you can now use this and apply this in your Qlik application.